안녕하십니까. 저는 서울대학교 교육종합연구원 원장으로 있는 도구교육과 성상환 교수입니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘 교육종합연구원 제2차 해외석학초청강연에 이렇게 다들 와주셔서 감사드립니다. 오늘 저희 초청강연에는 리노에 있는 네바다 주립대 유진 박 교수님을 모시고 특별 강연을 듣도록 하겠습니다. I would like to introduce Dr. Eugene Bak to the audience. We are very delighted to have Dr. Eugene Bak for our special invited talk. And Eugene Bak is a historian of East Asia, especially Korean politics and society from the 15th to the early 20th century. After studying at UCLA and Harvard, Park completed a postdoc with the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale and has held faculty appointments at the University of California, Irvine, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Nevada, Reno. Dr. Eugene Bak has also taught at the Harvard, Korea, McGill, Seoul National, and the Yonsei, as well as giving some 70 invited lectures, speeches, or presentations, including the 26th annual Stanley Spector Memorial Lecture on East Asian History and the Civilization at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the author of 5 books and is also interested in genealogy, population genetics, primatology, and portraiture and religious studies. Various high-profile projects have consulted with him, including Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. That was for PBS. And the Varieties of Democracy. In 2016, Dr. Eugene Bak co-chaired the organizing committee of the of the 8th Biennial World Congress of Korean Studies. And today, Dr. Bak will deliver invited lecture. It's entitled Challenges of Periodizing Korean History in a Global Context. Please join me to welcome Dr. Eugene Bak.
Okay, thank you, Professor Song, for your kind introduction. I would also like to express my gratitude toward Professor Song and the Center for Educational Research for the organizing and the hosting this event. I want to begin with some additional information about myself to put my presentation in context. I am a Korean historian trained in the United States. In 1999, I completed my PhD dissertation on the late Joseon military examination, Bukwa in Korean, military examination system. I was especially interested in Joseon Dynasty Korea's status mobility, the 신분 변동, and also genealogy. In the last 24 years, my research and teaching interests have come to include population genetics, as Professor Song mentioned in the introduction, global history, and deep history. That is a study of history not only using written documents, but also archaeology, anthropology, genetics, all disciplines, so that we narrate the story of the human beings, even the Neanderthals, going back tens of thousands of years. Besides more Korea-focused courses, teaching East Asia Survey and the World History courses. So besides more Korea-focused courses, teaching East Asia Survey and the World History courses have helped me think about the periodizing Korean history, so 한국사 시대구분론, in a global context. And more recently, my participation as a Korea expert on the varieties of democracy, or the VDEM project, which is based in Sweden, allowed me to reflect further on Korea's political institutions since 1776 from various angles. So for example, one insight I gained from this project is that among English-speaking scholars in the West, they tend to consider various political associations in the Joseon period faction. Like I guess the older Korean word would be 당파, but as I've been advocating all along, there's really, from the global history perspective, there's really no problem in considering Nam인, Bugin, or Noran, Soran as political parties, if we were to consider political parties in other early modern societies. So my ongoing learning as a Korean historian in the United States continue to address the challenge of engaging with students, colleagues, and the general public who know little about Korea. For many English readers, quote-unquote Korea evokes North Korea as a nuclear weapon and ballistic missile programs. Typically, unable to locate Korea readily on a world map, many, at least Americans, would look for Korea in the Southeast Asia, especially when they hear South Korea, Southeast Asia. Because for most Americans, their understanding of Asia, which is really East Asia, is China and Japan, pure and simple. I know the South Korean media really reported as if K-pop has conquered the world, and it's now everybody was like, that's just not true. It's not true. And interestingly, compared to North Korea, which receives much media coverage. So China and Japan, pure and simple. So South Korea is lost in the middle of the binary of bad North Korea and China versus a good America and its ally Japan. Nobody mentions South Korea. So when any U.S. president visits Northeast Asia, the media either gloss over or just fail to mention South Korea. A few years ago, when Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK hosted a G7 with the leaders of South Africa, India, and South Korea present, CNN just cropped out the President Moon Jae-in. They just want to keep it simple for the vast majority of Americans. And what about South Korea's global brands such as Hyundai, Samsung, and LG that have gained presence in many people's daily lives? Sure, most Americans have heard of these brands, but most would not necessarily know that these products are from South Korea. What else a reader may know, reader of Korean history book may know, depends on the age and background. For some, the Korean War, the Third World, poverty, and the communism come to mind, whereas many teenagers and the young adults are certainly fans of K-pop. More people seem to be discovering Korean cuisine, although it still lags behind Chinese, Japanese, Thai, and the Vietnamese food in popular appeal. And regardless, most would profess relative ignorance about Korea as a recorded history of 2 millennia. So why? The short answer is this is still a reflection of, it's a lingering legacy of colonialism, American colonialism. So as well known, in the early 20th century, Japanese colonial historiography supplanted Confucian historiography as the dominant Korean style of writing about Korea's past. So the 식민사관 was propagated or advocated by the apologists of Imperial Japan. Japanese historiography as such treated Japan as distinct from rest of Asia and on an equal footing with the West, while adopting the West's negative Orientalist portrayal of Asia, including Korea and China. The Hsikmin used the three main lines of argument to rationalize Japan's takeover over Korea. First, the common ancestry theory, the 동조론, argued that Japan and Korea share common origins, and accordingly, a natural bond existed between the peoples, between the two peoples. So it was natural that Big Brother, with the benevolent intentions, take over and protect Korea. Secondly, the stagnation theory, the 정체론, argued that the Korea had not even entered the feudal phase, the 봉건시대, or the medieval phase of a normal society developments that modern West and, of course, Japan had supposedly undergone. This meant that the Korea needed Japan's brotherly protection and tutelage to help Korean people move forward. And thirdly, according to the dependency theory, which emphasized the 타율성, that the Korean history was always shaped by the outside forces. Korea lacked independence and distinctiveness, as Japan and continental Asiatic forces had shaped this history. And in response, Korean nationalist historians wrote a history centered around the 민족, the ethnically or racially defined Korean nation. Some intellectuals sought to promote national consciousness to resist the Japanese domination. They declared that the Korea's history is the history of the Korean 민족, a distinct people descended from the mythical 단군, a demigod, so half human, half god, and the founder of Korea, the first state, the Gojoseon. Nationalist historians emphasized the large territories of Gojoseon and other ancient Korean states by which they judged the present state of Korean nation. That is, Korea is a colony now, presently, but Korean people have something to look back to, and there's something that should inspire them in their continuing struggle against the Japanese. By contrast, positivist historiography, 실증사학, produced in the 1930s by the first generation of Korean scholars trained in the modern research methodology, trained in Japan, attempted to study history more objectively. So what is positivism? Positivism regards a certain or positive knowledge as based on natural phenomena, their properties and relations, interpreted through logic and reason. And that this information acquired through sensory experience constitutes a source of true knowledge and verified data or positive facts. And that as such, positive facts constitute empirical evidence. So trained at Japanese universities in the early 20th century, the early group of Korean positivist historians produced detailed studies on various subjects, especially ancient Korea. Along with the like-minded Japanese colleagues, they really laid the foundation for the scholarship of subsequent generations of academic Korean historians, like Lee Byung-do, for example, especially in South Korea, Japan, and the West. Another important group of Korean scholars who received the training in modern historical methodology in the 1930s in Japan produced a Marxist historiography. It's still influential, even not just North Korea, but even in South Korea today. Marxist historians focus on social classes and economic factors in analyzing causality over time. This approach views the resolution of class conflict, 계급투쟁, as producing social progress through distinct developmental stages, namely communal society, slave society, feudalism, capitalism. Well, for capitalists, it should stop there, right? But if you're Marxist, then socialism and communism. The end state of history in which society is classless. And countering the Japanese colonial historians' claim that pre-colonial Korea was stuck in the slave society phase, Marxist Korean historians such as Baek Namun sought to demonstrate that Korea too had attained feudalism, the 동군사회. While debating the extent to which capitalism developed in Korea before Western imperialism, such Marxist historians also desired to show paths toward national liberation from Japanese. Subsequently, Marxist scholarship became the orthodox historiography in North Korea in a form that highlights Kim Il-sung as the revolutionary who effected national triumph over both feudalism and colonialism. In South Korea since 1945, modified Marxist historiography, so-called internal development theory, 내재적 발전론, has been influential since the 1960s, especially as advocated by such scholars as Eugene. Countering colonial historiography, the internal development theory highlights the watersheds or important dividing lines in Korean history. Each watershed marked by the rise and triumph of a new socio-economic force. So, for example, the early Joseon, the example of such a dividing line or the watershed in early Joseon history is a conflict between the Hungu and the Sarin. Also, the internal development historiography sees the socio-economic base for political participation becoming broader throughout history. So, as you could see, this is still influenced by Marxism, right? The internal development theory initially shunned obvious or overt or explicit references to class conflict, the expression like 계급투쟁, because South Korea, as we all know, still has a 국가보안법, right? The national security law. But needless to say, the internal development theory then was still centered. The foundation of it is the Marxism. In the 1970s and 80s, many progressive scholars in South Korea tried to understand and narrate history from the point of view of a 민중, the popular mass. As the scholars in history and other disciplines such as literature and theology emphasize, the 민중, so who is 민중, what is 민중, right? So 민중 consists of those who are politically oppressed. So 정치적으로 탄압을 받는 세력. Those are socially marginalized, 사회적으로 주변에 있는 세력, or the 집단. Those are culturally denigrated or despised, or economically exploited. In the South Korean context at the time, the 민중 as such comprised the victims of South Korea's authoritarian regime, the victims of South Korea's subservient position vis-a-vis the United States as a colonial power, or South Korea or the economic injustice stemming from industrialization in South Korea. Since the 1980s in South Korea, some populist writers outside the academy have produced something called the 제2차, the outsider historiography. They propagated the earlier nationalistic interpretation of a 단군, redefining him as the Korean people's historical ancestor and the founder of Korea's first state, rather than just a legendary mythical figure. And in doing so, the 제2차 scholars accused the academic historians of denying 단군's alleged historicity, and more fundamentally, of perpetuating the Japanese colonial historiography. I think even today, many history enthusiasts and others who like to study Korean history they accuse the professional historians such as myself as the 식민사관주의자 from their point of view. Because from their point of view, we're always denying or underestimating the Korean people's the greatness. So needless to say, these are amateur historians at best, but they're still very influential. For example, I think it was about 10 years ago, the South Korea's Northeast Asia History Foundation, 동북아 역사재단, was funding very expensive major projects, publications of research and conferences on the ancient Korean history among Western scholars, well, not just Western scholars, but those who work on Asian study, but there was a very strong, unfortunate lobbying by the 제2차, who, and in the end, the South Korean government pulled the plug, just to stop funding. Now, moving on, by the 1970s, now we finally get to a group of Korean historians who are more, whom I'm going to be talking about more for my presentation. By the 1970s, a small but a growing number of scholars in Europe and North America were producing more purely empirical studies of Korean history. Careful, relatively microscopic analyses have challenged the various claims made by the internal development theory and the Marxist historiographies. So these Western scholars generally find that many of the arguments or the discoveries of South Korean historians are not based on enough evidence, or many of the South Korean arguments that exaggerate certain phenomena from the Western perspective. In particular, such Western scholars have presented strong evidence for the continuity of Korea's ruling elite since Goryeo. So, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the Goryeo elite and the Joseon elite are supposed to be different, right? Goryeo elite, we generally in Korea, they're generally called a Gwijok, right? And in South Korea, you cannot call Joseon elite Gwijok, right? They're supposed to be the Yakban or Sadaegu or whatnot. With the assumption being that the Joseon elite was a more socially broadly grounded, and it was a more inclusive group, and it represented a progress in Korean history. But of course, if one were to consider early modern Eurasian history as a whole, from 1450 to 1850, of course, everywhere there was an aristocracy that went straight back to the Middle Ages, and it's exactly the same in Korean history. At any rate, the Western scholarship also tends to view modernity, or 근대성, as a byproduct of particularities of a Western European historical experience. Therefore, until recently, most Western language works on Korea avoided or rejected terms like a medieval and early modern, or I guess the medieval with 중세, or the early modern. Well, actually, how to translate early modern to Korea, that gets a little bit tricky, as I'm going to explain in a moment. So I'll just call it early modern for now. And such Western scholars regarded these terms, or using these terms, as a forcing Korea's or any non-Western history into sort of a European mold. And I will return to this point as it relates to the main topic of my talk today. By the end of the 80s, among Koreanists, there was a growing number of skeptics, critics of an empirical approach who were pursuing postmodernist historiography. In critiquing more purely empirical scholarship, postmodernists have problematized such notions as truth, objectivity, teleology, determinism, grand narratives, universality, and essentialism. They see subjectivity, 주관성, as inherent in any purportedly objective scholarship. In other words, there's no such thing as dispassionate objectivity. And postmodernists utilize various critical theories in cultural studies. And in doing so, their works devote more attention to groups deemed relatively neglected by older scholarship, including gender, racial, and ethnic minorities, as well as popular culture. So while Korean historical scholarship or historiography has undergone these developments as I have outlined, discussions of world history have changed considerably in the last few decades. And discussions of world history have come to recognize a four-part periodization. Namely, the classical era, also known as the ancient period or antiquity, from about 600 BCE to 600 CE. And what at least a sedentary literate societies of Afro-Eurasia had in common was that they all experienced the rise of foundational institutions and ideas, including Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. So precisely the reason why we can consider this period the classical age, or the classical era. Also, Roman and Chinese political institutions and ideologies continue to inspire subsequent generations. Because without denial, without any, there can be no denial that Rome, ancient Rome, and the early China really laid the foundation for subsequent social political developments in these both ends of Eurasia. Then during the post-classical era that followed, also known as the medieval period, including late antiquity, from about 600 to 1450, the Indian Ocean world remained the epicenter of global wealth and technological advances, with such powerful actors as the China's Tang Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, which at its peak controlled North Africa, the Middle East, and Persia, and later the Mongol Empire. And then during the early modern era, from roughly 1450 to 1850, Europe's conquest of the New World laid the foundation for the West's eventual industrial revolution, imperialism, and colonialism, while the epicenter of the global wealth and technological advances shifted from the Indian Ocean world to the Atlantic world. And in the late modern era, since the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution not only put the West in a paramount position by the turn of the 20th century, since then, the center of gravity in terms of the world's wealth and technological advances has shifted from the Atlantic world to the Pacific Rim, with the rise of America and Japan, as well as the re-emergence of China as a global power. Now, while the four-part periodization as such frames a shared understanding of global history, as I just explained. In other words, each of these four periods or the eras, there are certain patterns that are widely shared throughout much of the world, or at least among the literate sedentary societies of Afro-Eurasia. Okay? So while discussions of understandings of world history has evolved to this point, English-speaking scholarship in Korean history has reacted very differently to the various periodization terms associated with what I just discussed. Those who work on the pre-Goryeo period, so let's say the Three Kingdoms period, 삼국시대, or the late Shilla Empire, such scholars have settled for the term or the expression early Korea. Yeah, they don't really use the term ancient Korea, but they call it early Korea. Although they do not seem to object to such terms as ancient or even classical for this period. Likewise, those who work on the Goryeo period use the term medieval, 중세. My take is that perhaps because English-speaking historians who work on the pre-1392 or the pre-Joseon history are so small in number, I think they've come to accept such terms as ancient, classical, or medieval as calendrical terms, kind of like a 달력 or the time calendar, without necessarily suggesting or arguing that the ancient Korea and the medieval Korea share the similarities with the classical Rome or medieval Europe, respectively. In stark contrast, until about 2 decades ago, Anglophone or the English-speaking historians who work on the Joseon period, and they far outnumber those who work on the pre-1392 Korean history. The Joseon scholars have generally were refusing to call the Joseon period Korea's early modern era for various reasons. Because chronologically, Joseon period from about 1390 to let's say the mid-19th century, it perfectly corresponds to early modern era in other parts of the world. Now, regardless of a historian's regional expertise, a typical discussion of an quote-unquote early modern society assesses or evaluates things like a state centralization, so 국가 중앙화, population growth, 인구 증가, urbanization, 도시화, burgeoning trade, more upward social mobility, an emerging national identity, the development of a print culture, and the advancement in science and technology. So all these things are important criteria. On these accounts, so using these criteria, many English-speaking historians in the West find that Joseon just was not early modern enough. They say, come on, I mean, how could we call early modern? How can we consider Joseon 후기 early modern? And interestingly, this sort of criticism of or the downgrading of Joseon society as a very backward, the helpless, and in the end it was corrupt, and ultimately it was responsible for Korea's loss of independence. That kind of attitude is very strong among South Korea's conservatives. And I think the newspaper where you could see the strongest expression of like a Joseon dynasty bashing is Joseonilbo. Very negative. Also, such English-speaking scholars reject such terms of quote-unquote early modern and medieval as instruments of a Eurocentric straitjacketing non-European historical history. In other words, they argue that we cannot use terms like early modern or medieval for Korean history because we're trying to force Korea's historical experience into something like a Eurocentric paradigm or the model. But at the same time, in the last 2 decades, a growing number of Anglophone historians have been viewing the early modern simply as a calendrical term. So in other words, we're simply calling that time stretch by this name. We're not necessarily saying that period A in Europe and period A in Korea and the period A in India, everything was the same. But we were just using the same term so that everybody knows which period we're talking about or which time stretch. It's a calendrical term. So calendrical term, and also as a discursive tool, that is a tool to discuss and to have a dialogue, comparative dialogue about especially the connections across the world from about 1450 to 1850. So for this growing number of English-speaking historians who are comfortable, who accept using the term early modern for Korea, for them, Joseon history gives valuable data, gives plenty of materials for discussion that can enrich the global historical discussion that have so far been dominated by or mostly focused on Europe, the rise of the West. And certainly looking at it from this point of view, yes, there are certain institutions and ideas or developments in the late Joseon Korea that were even more advanced, just to use that word, than what was happening in the 18th century England. What has further complicated the situation, that is, as we talk about, as scholars of Korea historians continue to talk about whether we could, call Joseon period early modern, is that two totally incompatible uses of the term early modern to divide Korean history have come to coexist. So there are two very different usages of early modern. First, what some scholars like to call short convention. The short convention of the early modernity corresponds to the Geundae in Korean history, 1870 to 19, let's say from 1870 to 19 teens. So first of all, I should point out that when we speak in Korean, we customarily divide the Geundae and Hyundai, right? In English, we don't divide Geundae and Hyundai. Hyundai is actually part of modern. Yeah, we don't really say contemporary, or Hyundai gets translated as a contemporary period, but we don't really use that in English. But at the same time, Korean scholars use the term Geundaesung as a translation from modernity, right? So I hope then you can see what's going on here, right? So Geundae, as a term used by Koreans, is referring to like a late 19th or early 20th century, which is a time period when Korea encountered the Industrial Revolution West's modernity. And during that period, Koreans came into contact with, supposedly came into the Enlightenment, rationalism, citizenship, notions of a nation state, the nation, a long list of things. And supposedly by the end of that period, then Korea enters a truly modern period, which I guess in Korean is a Hyundai. So that's the short convention. Whereas, and according to this view, that's right. According to that view, that Korea's Geundae was also complicated by and followed by the colonial modernity, right? So the Shinminji Geundaesung, because of the Japanese occupation. And according to this short convention, modernity means a process that began in Britain in the late 18th century, before spread across continental Europe, and then the rest of the world. And this usage, unfortunately, conflicts with how the term early modern is used among mainstream historians, not just those who work on Europe, but those who work on other parts of the world. For example, according to an important journal, Journal of Early Modern History, the early modern period refers to 1300 to 1800. So definitely Joseon period chronologically fits right there, right? And according to the Journal of Early Modern History, which by the way, it covers history of all regions of the world, a rapidly increasing level of global interaction accelerated between 1300 and 1800 in the aftermath of a Mongol conquest in the east and up to the onset of industrialization in the west. In other words, this common understanding of an early modern period has nothing to do, it's not necessarily about industrial revolution or Britain or capitalism, but no, it's about connections. Yeah. And this, what many scholars have called the long convention, of course, it corresponds to Geundae in Korean history, the term which I suppose is not used that much in Korea anymore. And I think common criticism of a use of the term Geundae, at least among some Korean historians who are more Marxism oriented, is that Geundae was just the concept that the Japanese invented, so that the saying that the Japan was just like the West and the Koreans were simply copying. And so Geundae is not used that much in Korea, in South Korea these days. So in light of all this, then I'm sure you're thinking, well, where do I stand, right? What's my take? In light of all this, I have at least two thoughts on the challenges of periodizing Korean history in a global context. And the first of the two, I think, is really a matter of a convention. Now, please consider what I'm now wearing, right? A suit, a dress shirt, a tie. This is definitely an outfit that has origins in early modern Europe, right? This did not grow out of something people in the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Persia, the Mughal Empire, or Qing China, or Tokugawa Japan, or Joseon Korea were wearing. No, this has nothing to do with what they're wearing. So, and of course, the kind of dress that I'm wearing right now has become almost a universal business outfit, right? In the modern world, contemporary world. Likewise, such words or terms as ancient, antiquity, or classical for the period from about 600 BC to 600 CE. Such terms as a medieval, late antiquity, or post-classical for the period from about 600 to 1450. And such terms as the early modern for the period from about 1450 to 1850 have come to enjoy wide circulation. It's used widely. That historians now speak of medieval India, early modern Middle East, while most English-speaking Korean historians say that we should not speak of early modern Korea, but yes, people do say early modern India, medieval Persia. And when such Persia historians or Middle East specialists use these terms, they're definitely not suggesting that these regions were same as a medieval England or early modern Germany. Yeah, they're using these terms as calendrical terms. In other words, such terms as the medieval and early modern have become calendrical in a way that still recognizes that, for example, January in Korea, in Northern Hemisphere, and the January in New Zealand, in the Southern Hemisphere, is opposite. We all know that, right? Yeah. But by using the term January, we are being precise about what part of the solar calendar that we're referring to. Now, insisting on referring to Korea as of 1900 as an early modern in the sense of 근대, right? Or insisting on using Korean dynastic names like 고구려, 백제, 발해, 고구려, and Joseon to someone who knows nothing about Korean history, of course, it's a hindrance, right? It's not very helpful. And ultimately, as a professor emeritus of UCLA, John Duncan has observed, refusing to use these common terms might amount to what he called the self-marginalization of Korean history in the global community of historians. Yeah, in other words, we're choosing to make ourselves or go for 주변화, Korean history. Now, turning to my second thought on using global periodization. My second thought has to do with my own research interest in the hereditary status hierarchy, the status mobility, and the population genetics. And I've discovered that the reliable genealogy, I'm not talking about just any forward genealogical claims, but reliable genealogies that can be independently verified. Reliable genealogies are very useful as records of a significant historical events. Now, our attempt to determine or assess the reliability of a genealogy has gained much strength from recent advances in Y-DNA and the mitochondrial DNA analysis. Because the Y-DNA analysis allows a tracing of patrilineal ancestries of a human population, so father's father's father. And the mitochondrial DNA, likewise, mother's mother's mother. And what we can learn from genealogies and genetics together are three patterns shared across literate, sedentary societies of Afro-Eurasia. So three. Number one, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to trace back the ancestry of any Eurasian, even an aristocratic family or person beyond the medieval period. even somebody like a King Charles III of the UK, or his mother, Queen Elizabeth, we cannot trace their real ancestors beyond the Middle Ages. Yeah, there's a huge gap or the break between the classical era and everything that came after in terms of availability of records and also what kind of families have been the major social-political actors. So even with the aristocrats as of 1900, we cannot trace their reliable patrilineal genealogy beyond, I don't know, let's say 500-600 AD or the CE. Pattern number 2, the early modern beginnings. So in other words, humans or populations or families that were of middle social standing, let's say significant merchants, major merchants, professionals, as of 1900. So let's just call them middle class. The farthest we could trace their reliable genealogies back to the beginning of about 1600, so beginning of the early modern era. Third pattern, the rest of the population, so perhaps like 80-90% of the human beings. How far we could trace our reliable genealogies entirely depends on the availability of a government compiled records, such as census records, military records, and the amount of such records become larger only with the rise of modern nation states. I mean, of course, I could just go down the long list of examples, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. And just one last point I like to make as a way of conclusion is that such terms as a classical, post-classical, and early modern are here to stay. They're definitely not going on. I mean, they might change a bit. If anything, these terms are facilitating dialogue among historians working on various regions of the world. We cannot avoid acknowledging that such terms as a medieval and early modern emerged from historical research on Europe or the West. I mean, there's no denial. Still, I would like to share with you what one of my professors, when I was a graduate student, the late Angeliki Laiu, a Byzantinist at Harvard, observed when I was her student. She basically said, what matters is not so much the term or the word itself as what we mean by it. Yeah. And what this means to me is that Anglophone or the English-speaking scholars in the Korean history field should definitely avoid a self-marginalization by following what I believe has become conventions of periodization in world history. Now, following the commonly used periodization terms does not mean we only care about how Goryeo lacked medieval France's feudal institutions or how Joseon did not produce the kind of urban life and commercial boom experienced by early modern England. In other words, one of the common reasons that many English-speaking Korean historians continue to object to calling Joseon period early modern is that, look, the Seoul's Hanseongsa population was only 200,000 or 250,000. How could you compare that with the 19th century London with a population of 1 million? So in other words, they have a very sort of like pristine, idealized picture of some sort of 19th century England as if that represents Hungary and the Russia and then the entire Europe, which of course is not true. Yeah, there was a lot of variation within the continent of Europe itself. In fact, some of the differences were even greater than difference between, in some areas, Joseon Korea and the 19th century Italy or England. And so instead of doing that, I think espousing conventions, generally used conventions, allow Anglophone historians to really complicate evolving understandings of early modern world as not just something that originated in the West, but it was really a phenomenon where there were more connections, interactions among different regions of the world. Thank you, and now I look forward to comments from Dr. Gabor Sebo.
Gabor Sebo. Thank you, Dr. Eugene Park, for your wonderful presentation. And before we take Q&A, Dr. Gabor Sebo will be today's discussant, and he is the Gyuganggak Fellow at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the floor, Professor Song. And while I'm sharing my PPT to have not just for myself, but to have the audience to follow my main comments, I would like to thank for the opportunity for the director of the Center for Education Research, so Professor Song, to be invited for this wonderful lecture of Professor Park. And as you can see here, the original connection with Professor Park can be stemmed from a book review request by Pacific Affairs back in 2022. As you can see here, the cover of Professor Park's latest monograph on Korean history. It was released by Stanford University Press last year, and actually the book talk will be placed tomorrow from 10 a.m. until 12 p.m. at Gyuganggak Institute. So if you got the link, you are of course warmly welcome to participate in this event also. And when I got this opportunity, I mean this request from Pacific Affairs, I was a little bit hesitant, to make this book review, not just because it was my second book review, but I asked myself, how can I make a book review about a historical textbook, with historical facts, and also some archival descriptions. However, when I checked the table of contents, and especially the periodization of the Korean historiography, which we just heard from Professor Park, I could realize some uniqueness in this historical textbook, because also as Professor Park mentioned, the calling words of calendrical terms, which of course I also agree that they locate or detect some chronological common sensus on the periodization. At the same time also Professor Park mentioned about two very important division lines in Korean historical periodization. This is the geographical division and also the genealogical division. Again, I really like this term of Professor Park of the calendrical terms. And the second aspect, which I found quite appealing, the similarities between the same periodization for Korea and Europe. Of course, I don't want to repeat Professor Park's words about the two main wings, so the pre-Koryo and pre-Joseon historians, labelings of the Korean historiography, I mean the periodization of the Korean history. I just want to also mention that he said that ancient Korea and medieval Korea shared many similarities with classical Rome and medieval Europe respectively. At the same time, we have to take into consideration that these are not, of course, the same, as also Professor Park mentioned that, in some certain respect, at some specific age of Korea was more advanced, if I can repeat the word of Professor Park, than, for example, Great Britain at the same time. So, yeah, we have to also think about that. And about the four-part periodization, which I just collected here for the audience as well. Yeah, this is true that the Korean historiography's periodization is not the same with the global history and periodization, because as also Professor Park mentioned, that the global historians do not divide the modern period in this way. There is a common consensus, however, that the contemporary history, so the Hellwesen or Zeitgeschichte in German, can be dated mainly after the Second World War, so mainly from 1945. In Korea, it's mainly after the colonial period ended, so the liberation era. At the same time, what is interesting here, what I found, that the Journal of Early Modern History somehow classifies the early modern, the term of early modern, from the 14th century until the 19th century. However, of course, it's not the same like the early modern in Korean terminology. At the same time, what I found more interesting here, related to this four-part periodization, is related to the peninsulas, the Korean peninsulas, two very important, historical happenings back in the 19th century. These are actually very close to each other. So the Kewaki, so the Enlightenment period, which is, after the one-sided Korean-Japanese treaty, or the Treaty of Gangwa, in 1876, when Western civilization was introduced to Korea, and the Kehanki period, so the open port period, from 1876 until the beginning of the colonial era, so 1910. So I would call this period, this very special period, so the 1870s until the start of the colonial period, like a transition period. So I wouldn't classify this period neither the early modern nor the late modern period. At the same time, the issues with the Eurocentrism in Korean historical periodization. Yes, in a broader critical sense, the four-part structuralization of the Korean history with the aim of matching Korean history to these periods may seem Eurocentric. And even there is a considerable effort to claim that these periods mean different, cover different aspects for Korea in order to, I would use the word of Professor Park, de-peripheralize, so de-marginalize Korean history. It still seems a little bit Eurocentric, as also I'm just recalling the words of the presenter, because due to the simple fact that the Anglophone global periodization and global history accounts were mainly also created by Eurocentric descriptors. In other words, there is a common phrase that the history is always written by the winners. So this is one aspect that I think it's also, there should be an effort to somehow avoid this Eurocentrism, at least in Korean historiographical periodization. this is a question among, and debate among historians how, so the methodology. The other things which I really find very impressive, as I mentioned, in addition to the term of calendrical terms, the geographical and genealogical division. Because the geographical division is legit due to the fact that medieval India and medieval Europe have some similarities, of course, in names and of course in chronology. At the same time, they also signify some different values, some different aspects, like the early modern Middle East is have some connections with early modern Korea. However, I mean the terms, however, they also hold some differences. But most of all, I'm especially pleased to recognize the genealogical based approach on periodizing Korean history, utilizing Professor Park's main research interest in hereditary status hierarchy, status mobility, and population genetics. Tracing of the patrilineal or matrilineal ancestries of different dynasties on the Korean peninsula definitely can brought about a more objective and closer picture on a more accurate historical periodization. And at this point I would, of course I'm not a genealogical expert, but I'm much more interested since my research area in the North Korean history and North Korean political structure and society. So when I heard about the genealogical perspective, some definitions, like for example the Koreanness or even Songbun, came to my mind. And also Professor Park mentioned about the nationalist historian's perspective. So I'm just wondering if this genealogical perspective, which is somehow recalls the pure bloodline of the Korean peninsula, especially from a North Korean perspective, because Songbun is also based on the ancestral bloodline, but much more, of course, entrenched in political loyalty and past merit. So I just also wanted to add this very interesting thing. And I think I don't have to go into details, but nowadays it's a very trendy word among the scholars in Korean studies, the word, to use the word of Koreanness. And actually nobody could define what Koreanness is. It's like a kind of entity of what the national identity of being Korean means. However, for example, Koreanness means a totally different thing in the south and the north. And I don't, I think, have to explain more on this. And what I found also very interesting here, that Professor Park's kind of American perspective on the calling word of Korea. I can just share the European perspective, because in Europe, if we see the news, two things, if Korea is in the news, two things came to the people's mind. I mean the ordinary people who are not expert in Korea. One thing is the nuclear missile tests of the North, so the nuclear threat coming from the North, or the soft power of South Korea. So totally two different images of North Korea. At the same time, I also believe that the Made in Korea catchphrase means a kind of cultural values and technological driven society, and also like high-tech values about the Korean, not just history, but the Korean symbols. But I would like to say here that Korea, in general, for me, that's why it was very intentional to use the word model, is not just, it doesn't cover just a peninsula, or doesn't cover just a nation or a history. Like the DPRK itself, Korea shall be considered as not just a value, but also a regional term. So Korea is an unavoidable player, I think, in East Asian region, and even though I understand Professor Park's point of view on the American perspective, that East Asia mainly covers in the US news just Japan and China, I still think that, and that South Korea is somehow neglected in this game. I still think that it's legit to use. And last but not least, I would just repeat Professor Park's last words, told by his late professor, that the scholars, the historians in Korean studies and in Korean historiography can debate about it. It can be, an eternal debate on the names of the specific periods. But what matters for the audience, that we have to immediately, know what they mean by that. I'm a film person, so I would use a film analogy here. Bernardo Bertolucci made a film, The Last Tango in Paris, and Marlon Brando said to the female character that just, please don't mention me names. What I mean here, again, not the names are the most important, but the audience, the recognition of the audience, that they have to get attached with these specific periods. So this was my comments. So 이상입니다. 감사합니다. And now I would give the floor to the audience if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gabor Sebo, for your comments. And now we could take some comments or questions from the floor or from the chat box. 제가 이야기로는 이제 한국 사회에 있어서 시대구분에 관한 이야기인데 글로벌 히스토리하고 어떤 식으로 이제 영어권에서 글로벌 히스토리하고 특히 이제 소장학자들인 거죠. 소장학자들의 관점, 그러니까 이 글로벌 히스토리하고 한국사 시대구분을 어떻게 좀 연결을 시킬 수 있을까, 그 부분에 대해서 굉장히 고민을 많이 하신 것 같습니다. 그러니까 특히 이제 저는 느낌이 아까 말씀하신 거 early modern, 이제 early modern이라는 표현이 굉장히 많이 이제 맴도는데 이 자리에는 또 한국사 또 역사 전공자 선생님들도 또 계시기 때문에 우리 학교에 학내에 계시는 이제 역사 전공 선생님들도 계시기 때문에 이런 영어권에서의 고민, 그리고 이제 우리 국내 학자분들은 이 부분들에 대해서 어떻게 좀 생각을 하시는지 좀 사회자로서 좀 궁금하기도 합니다. 예를 들어서 우리가 현대라는 표현도 있고, 아까 이제 현대는 영어에서는 contemporary라는 이제 표현을 우리가 번역을 하면은 그렇게 쓰는데 그게 그렇게 많이 쓰는 표현은 아니다는 거죠. 그래서 아까 이제 그런 말씀을 하셨고, 그런데 우리는 또 이제 현대라는 표현도 있지만은 근현대라는 표현도 쓰고, 아까 또 이제 근세라는 표현은 좀 이게 약간 아웃데이티드 된 표현 같다. 그러면은 김태형 선생님도 계신데 한국사를 적응하시는 분의 입장에서 한국에서의 좀 이런 그 시대 구분하는 부분에 대해서 조금 말씀해 주실 수 있으시면은.
여기 누르면 됩니까? 제가 영어를 못해서
작동하는지는 모르겠어요. 우리말로 그냥 하시면 될 것 같습니다.
서울대학교 사범대 역사교육과 김태입니다. 제가 한 5분, 10분 늦게 들어오고 또 제가 영어가 좀 짧아서 제대로 이해를 못하고 그냥 여기 프린트된 걸 내용을 보고 이런 거구나 하는데 아직까지 이해를 못하고 있어요. 다만 이제 유진 박 선생님의 그 중인 연구, 무인 연구에 굉장히 관심을 갖고 있고 또 한국의 학자들이 몇몇 분이 번역한 걸 저한테 갖다 줬으면 이제 번역하는데, 저도 예전에 그 대학원 다닐 때 80년대 대학원 다닐 때 한용호 선생님 지금 돌아가셨지만 그분이 맨날 작가 방법 가지고 맨날 우리한테 시켜요. 작가 방법 기록에서 진사 그쪽 말고 생업 말고 중인들 뽑을 때 그 작가 방법을 분석하면서 굉장히 괴로웠던 적이 있었습니다. 작가 방법을 보면서 이른바 성원록이라고 해서 중인들의 그 가계하고 비교 분석하면서 이들이 왜 계속 중인에 남았는지, 아니면 일부는 또 양반도를 이렇게 띄는 경우도 있는데, 최근에 이제 그 진주 옆에 보면 단성이 있는데 단성 사족 연구라고 김준영 선생이 밝히면서 까보니까 16세기, 17세기 다들 중인들이에요. 향리들이에요. 이들이 이제 신분 세탁을 해가지고 18세기, 19세기 양반이 되는 모습인데, 근데 꼭 그런 건 아니에요. 울산이라든가 또 저기 전라남도 쪽에 보면 국시, 단양국 국시들 보면 그냥 중인으로 남아 있는 거예요. 그러니까 모든 중인이어서 양반으로 가는 게 아니라 지역마다 다 다르다는 걸 이제 확인하게 되는데, 그런 점에서 이제 저희가 중인은 관심 갖는 게, 알다시피 선생님도 마지막 부분 그 얘기를 했지만 중인들 중에 체남선, 그 다음에 그 연상선도 그렇고 진학문 같은 사람들이 결국은 그 아버지의 부를 가지고 이제 유학도 가고 해서 출세를 하는데도 불구하고 1930년대 보면 일제시대에 불구하고 이미 신분제가 다 법제적으로 관습을 다 파괴된데도 불구하고 만주로 간단 말이에요, 이분들이. 그러니까 여전히 의식상으로는 중인과 양반이란 그렇게 차별의식이 남아있구나. 그러니까 이들이 그렇게 유학을 갔다 온 최고의 엘리트층이 됐음에도 불구하고 자기들이 한국사에서 잊지를 못하는 거예요. 그래서 만주로 가서 새로운 자기 세계를 건설하는 게 연상섭이라든가 진학문, 체남선인데, 그런 부분에서 좀 더 근대까지 오시면 더 좋은 연구가 되지 않을까 기대하고요. 시대구분 얘기는 뭐 제가 전체사를 하지는 않지만 적어도 좀 한국사에서 가장 큰 논쟁 중에 하나가 세 가지가 있죠. 다 하나가 통일신라와 그 삼국시대 신라를 다르게 볼 건가, 같게 볼까, 독립적이냐, 연속적이냐, 단절적이냐. 그러니까 백남은 같은 분은 단절적으로 보는 거죠. 흔히 말하는 서양을 기미 의식했는지 모르겠는데, 삼국시 신라는 고대로 만든 통일신라 썼던 중세다, 이런 바 피더리즘을 적용한, 물론 아시아적 공본적이긴 하지만 그렇게 보는 입장이근데, 한국사학계에서는 그냥 막시스트 접근보다는 주로 이제 보는 접근이 문화사적인 접근이. 그래서 한국의 주류 사학계 문화사적을 보니까 뭐 통일신라도 삼국시대 신라와 다를 게 하나도 없더라. 그래서 같이 고대를 처리합니다. 그러나 이제 저희까지 유별 나가지고 김용석 이제 그런 시각이 강한지 몰라도 통일신라를 이제 이행기로 보든지 아니면 그 중세로 보려고 하는 노력이에요. 그러다 보니까 고려도 바라보는 관점이 굉장히 다릅니다. 고려와 조선은 어떠냐? 아까도 말씀 메디비얼이냐, 조선은 그냥 프리모던이냐, 이런 구분인데, 저희과 입장에서는 비주류 입장입니다. 고려나 조선이나 큰 차이가 없다. 지배층도 사실 뜯어가 보니까 다르지 않더라. 그리고 과정법도 사실 전식과 다른 게 하나 없다. 그런데 불구하고 이제 주류가 이제 문화사학장에 보니까 고려하고 조선을 달리 보는 거죠. 그래서 프리모던이라고 조선을 굳이 하는 거예요. 그건 이제 일본에서 이런 교토대학교의 영향도 많이 받았고, 또 하나는 이제 근대성이라고 부분을 찾지 못하니까 우리 나름대로 근세성이라는 부분을 찾아내서 조선과 이제 그 고려를 달리 보는데, 근데 최근에 이제 이 서울대학교 국사학과의 젊은 소장학자들이 아니다, 뭐 다를 게 뭐 있느냐, 같다라는 얘기가 조금씩 나오기 시작했어요. 여전히 지금 논쟁 중이고, 또 하나는 이제 근현대 문제인데, 근현대에서도 이제 대부분 주류 사학에서 해방 이전을 하면 민족 문제를 두고 보니까 식민지 이전이냐 이후에 따라서 근대고 이후다 이렇게 보는데, 저희과는 달라요. 저희과는 늘 이제 비주류인데 늘 다양해야지 발전하는데, 저희과는 세계사의 보편성을 생각해보자. 생각했을 때 1차 세계대전, 러시아 혁명이 갖는 의미가 작지 않다. 한국사에 굉장히 영향을 미쳤다. 그러니까 자꾸 민족 문제로 가지고 볼 게 아니라 세계사의 보편성에 봤을 때 계급 문제일 수도 있고 문화 문제인데, 1차 세계대전과 러시아 혁명이 어떻게 한국 사회를 진동시켰고, 그것이 3.1운동 이후에 새로운 국가 건설이 나타나기 때문에, 그리고 그것이 해방 후에 변한 게 없다. 인물 자체를 봤을 때 박헌영이가 일제 때 박헌영하고 해방 후에는 박헌영이 같은 사람도 아니고 노선도 같은 거다. 그래서 저희과에서는 현대사 1919년 3.1운동부터 봐요. 근데 이건 비주류입니다. 한국 사회에서는 여전히 민족 문제를 먼저 보기 때문에. 근데 이제 그런 거에 대해서 이제 유진 박사가 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금한 게, 앞에는 좀 말씀하셨는데, 근현대 경우에 특히나 미국 사학회에서 한국사 시대 구분할 때 이 한국 주류학계 같이 45년 8월 15일로 보는지, 아니면 1919년 3.1운동에 대한 그 이전을 보는 건지, 이제 궁금한 건 그런 겁니다. 너무 장황하게 말씀드려서 죄송합니다.
예, 감사합니다. 좀 두세 가지 생각이 나는데요. 일단 조선 후기 이제 시대로 내려오면 그 양반 인구가 증가하고, 전에 양반이 아니었던 사람들이 이제 양반으로, 그게 좀 그 영어권과 한국어권의 문화의 차이인지 아니면 용어의 문제인지 모르겠는데, 이제 적어도 이제 서양에서는 물론 서양도 이제 시대가 내려오고 이제 상업이 발전을 하면 이제 그 전에 그 중세 귀족의 후손들이 아닌 사람들이 이제 부를 축적을 하고 관직에도 나아가고, 그런데 그 사람들을 아리스토크라시를 전혀 간주를 안 해요. 서양 문화적인 차원에서. 근데 한국에서는 벌써 그 시카타 히로시 사방박 그때, 그리고 특히 이제 어느 9년에서 이제 조선후기에 되면 유학 인구가 이제 70~80% 가서 양반의 인구가 증가할 때, 이제 과연 그 사람들이 본래 그 제지사적 구양들로부터 양반을 인정을 받았냐? 당연히 아니라고 할 수도 있지만, 또 어떻게 보면 이제 19세기를 들어오면 일부 지역에 다 이제 좀 통원이 양상이 나타나죠. 이제 결국 돈이 이제 통하는 사회가 되고, 그래서 이제 저는 저뿐만 아니라 이제 서양에서는 그 19세기의 이제 그 핵심 중에 하나, 측면 중에 하나를 뭐로 보냐면은 1800년 이전에는 그래도 나름대로 그 중세적인 봉건적인 신부원이 많이 작용을 하고, 근데 이제 상업화, 특히 이제 산업혁명을 겪으면서 이제 그 신분과 계급의 일치가 이제 더 이상 일치가 안 되는 거죠. 그래서 이제 20세기로 들어오게 되면은 물론 당연히 이제 그 잡과 중인 집안 출신 이제 그 최남성 같은 사람도 이제 뭐 부나 이제 문화적으로 이제 세련된거나 또 사회적 영향력에 미쳐서 웬만한 이제 양반의 상당수 시골 양반들보다는 더 뛰어나겠죠. 그렇지만 그 자기가 그래도 주민 집안의 후손이라는 거는 제가 아는 바로는 거의 뭐 6.25 때도 있었고, 이제 거의 이제 60년대 산업화가 진행되고, 이제 그 다음 세대에 가서 이제 완전히 없어지는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 그래서 그 이제 1945년을 분기점으로 보느냐, 아니면 1차 대전을 분기점으로 보느냐, 둘 다 저는 타당성이 있다고 생각을 합니다. 이제 그 1차 대전 되게 이제 그동안 오랫동안은 그 early modern, 한
1850년대 19세기 말까지 early modern을 하고 그 이후를 이제 모던으로 불러왔는데 최근에는 약간 그 혼란을 줄이기 위해서 그 후자를 late modern이라고 부르는 추세가 있습니다. 그러니까 이제 산업화가 이제 식민주의, 제국주의가 완전히 이제 진행이 되는 그거를 이제 late modern, 그리고 아직도 우리는 이제 late modern 시대에 살고 있는 거죠. 왜냐 그 식민주의의 여파를 우리가 이제 아직도 영향을 받고 있으니까요. 그래서 그래서 1차 세계대전 이미 그 전에 19세기만 1900년을 이제 늦어도 1900년을 그 early modern의 하한선으로 보는 것 같고, 1945년이 이제 분기점을 해서 중요성은 주로 이제 그는 이제 시대구분론, 좀 아주 그 원론적인 그 이제 근본적인 시대구분론보다는 차원에서 시대구분론보다 이제 그 국제 질서, 이제 냉전 그런 그 우리가 논의하는 데 있어서 중요한 분기점으로 보고 있지 않나 좀 그렇게 생각합니다.
네, 오늘 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 네, 여러모로 사실 많은 이제 자극도 됐고, 네, 그렇습니다. 말씀드렸듯이 저는 중국 당나라 전공이기 때문에요. 뭐 제가 한국사에 대한 이해도 짧은데, 그런데 하나 제가 궁금했던 거는 이 중국사의 경우, 중국사를 이제 글로벌 히스토리 관점에서 해석하려고 하는 대표적인 나라가 지금 현재 일본입니다. 근데 일본에서의 글로벌 히스토리의 시대 부분은 지금 이루어지고 있는 과정은 오늘 선생님이 말씀하신 4가지 시대와 시기는 조금 다른 듯 싶습니다. 그런데 그것이 갖는 의미는 저는 생각하기에는 자국사 이해와 연관돼서 시기 설정을 하는 건 아닐까, 이런 생각을 하고 있습니다. 근데 이제 그런 맥락에서 또 이제 현재 일본을 이해하는 데서 이제 자국사와 글로벌 히스토리의 관계를 설정을 하려고 하는데, 이제 그런 모습에서 일본의 현재의 모습 그리고 그 연구의 의미를 이렇게 좀 확인할 수 있는 것 같습니다. 근데 오늘 선생님 발표에 제가 좀 처음에 좀 생소했던 것은 제목이 글로벌 히스토리가 아니라 글로벌 컨텍스트였습니다. 그러면 저 컨텍스트, 글로벌 컨텍스트라는 말에서 이제 글로벌 히스토리와 한국사의 시대구분론이 자연스럽게 이어진다고 생각이 드는데, 그러면 이러한 이제 구상과 발상이 결국 미국이나 북미 학계에 왜 끼치는 영향이 있을 것이다. 근데 그건 사실 뭐랄까요, 제 연구 분야도 아니고, 그래서 그러한 선생님이 생각하시는 영향, 이런 것들을 좀 소개해 주시면 선생님의 연구와 또한 글로벌 히스토리에 대한 이해, 북미 학계에 대한 이해가 높아질 것 같아서 이 질문을 드립니다.
제목, 감사합니다. 이제 영문 제목을 제가 생각하는 데 있어서 컨텍스트가 좀 오해 소지가 있을 수 있군요. 물론 주제하다시피 한반도에서 흥망성쇠했던 이제 그 국가들, 왕조들이 이제 지난 2000년 전 시대를 거쳐서 이제 정말 다른 타 지역들하고 교류가 얼마나 있어요. 물론 시대에 따라서 다르고 또 그렇게 이제 특히 이제 동아시아를 벗어나는 직접적인 이제 거래 교류가 또 이제 19세기 이전까지 그렇게 많지 않았다고 봐야겠죠. 이제 동남아시아. 그래서 그렇게 보면은 이제 그 글로벌 컨텍스트가 이제 무의미해지고, 다만 제 의미가 제대로 전달이 됐는지 모르겠습니다. 발표 때 전달이 됐는지 모르겠습니다. 이런 classical era, post classical era, early modern이나 late modern이라 이런 용어들을 한국사도 쓸 수 있다라고 주장하는 주로 이제 소장학자들의 논지는 반드시 교류가 있었다라기보다는 이제 서로 비교할 만한 또 대조할 만한 그런 이제 현상들이 많고 그 틀 내에서 그리고 또 이제 특히 이제 1450년, 1500년 시대로 내려와서 이제 early modern들을 이제 서로 커넥션, 이제 실제로 이제 교류, 직간접적 그게 이제 늘어난다 해서 이제 이런 시대로 우리가 한국 사회도 적용을 해도 된다라고 그렇게 적용하는 것 같고요. 아까 처음에 이제 당대 연구하신다고 제가 무척 반가웠던 게 이제 적어도 영미권에서 이제 중국산 연구가 거의 명청되거든요. 그 이전은 잘 없고 그래서 이제 당대도 라는 발언은 이제 UC 버클리 오래 있었던 데이비드 존슨 같은 경우는 이제 메디발이라는 용어를 썼었죠. 일찍부터 썼고 또 그 학파들은 계속 지금도 쓰고 있고. 근데 제가 받은 느낌은 그리고 또 이제 일본에서도 나이토 학파인가요? 그래서 송대도 이제 뭐 정말 서양의 잣대를 우리가 적용하면 이미 송대도 이제 그 early modern이다. 그리고 제가 아는 바는 중국사 연구자들은 송대를 early modern이라고 보는 거에 대해서 아무 문제를 제기 안 하는 것 같습니다. 그렇지만 이제 그걸 송대라 부르냐 아니면 early modern China라 부르냐 약간 좀 중국이라는 또 나름대로의 그 자존심이 있고 그러니까 왜 굳이 서양학에서 나온 그런 용어를 쓸 필요 있냐 그냥 송대, 명대, 청대 부르지 뭐 근본적인 송대를 early modern으로 못 부를 이유는 없다고 보는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 명청대도 early modern 특히 이제 캘리포니아 학파 이제 early modern은 본에 아무 문제가 없는데 다만 관용상, 관례상 이제 late imperial China라고 부르는 것 같고요. 마지막 한 가지가 떠오른 생각은 그럼 이제 송대 이후에 중국의 엘리트, 반드시 관직에 나아갔던 집단들뿐만 아니라 그 진산 세력들, 영어로 이제 local gentry, 그 사람들이 이제 우리가 신뢰할 수 있는 족보가 가계가 어느 정도까지 소급이 되냐. 근데 제가 아는 바로는 그래도 확실히 우리가 신뢰할 수 있는 거는 올라가봤자 그냥 당대 말이고 그 전에는 좀 문제가 없지 않나 연결을 그렇게 알고 있습니다. 네.
맞습니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 예. 선생님들 뭐또 질문이 채팅방에 혹시 질문 있나요? 없나요? 네. 그러면 이것으로 오늘 류진박 교수님 모신 이 교육종합연구원 해외석학초청 강연회를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 발표해 주신 류진박 교수님께 다시 한번 그리고 가보 세보 박사님 오늘